It was a quiet, sunny afternoon in the small town of Maple Creek. The kind of day where everything seemed to slow down, where the air was still and the soft hum of nature filled the spaces between thoughts. But for one family, this seemingly peaceful moment was about to turn into something unexpected. Jake Harrington had always lived in the shadow of his father's empire. The Harrington family name was known across the globe, synonymous with power, wealth, and influence. Jake had never known what it was like to struggle, to wonder how the bills would get paid, or to worry about his future. He had grown up with every luxury imaginable. Expensive cars, a mansion in the hills, private tutors, vacations to exotic places. The world was at his feet. But even with all of this, Jake never felt truly happy. His father, Richard Harrington, was a man of business, a ruthless businessman who ruled his empire with an iron fist. Richard's success had come at a cost. He had no time for family, no time for relationships, and certainly no time for his son. Jake had been left to navigate life on his own, often feeling like a stranger in his own home. It was a Saturday when Jake found himself wandering the streets of Maple Creek, looking for something to occupy his time. His father was out of town on yet another business trip, and Jake felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. He had no friends, no one to turn to. The weight of his family's expectations pressed down on him like a constant, suffocating force. Jake entered a small cafe, one of those places where the old wooden tables seemed to carry stories of long-forgotten conversations. The air inside smelled of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries, and the soft clink of silverware created a calm rhythm in the background. It was a stark contrast to the cold, metallic world he was used to. As he sat down at a corner table, he noticed a young woman behind the counter. Her name was Emily, and she was a waitress at the cafe. She moved with a quiet grace, taking orders, delivering food, and always offering a warm smile to the regulars. Jake had seen her around a few times before, but today something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she seemed so at ease in this simple, humble environment. Maybe it was the kindness in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in a long time. Jake ordered his coffee and sat back, watching Emily as she moved about. She was different from the people he was used to. There were no airs of superiority, no hidden agendas. She seemed to care about every customer, as if they were the most important person in the room. It was refreshing in a way, but also made him feel a little uncomfortable. It wasn't long before Jake's father, Richard, walked into the cafe. Richard was a towering figure, his presence filling the room the moment he entered. He was dressed in his usual expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, and his eyes sharp with a constant intensity. Jake stiffened in his seat, feeling that familiar sense of being overshadowed by his father. Richard didn't even notice Jake at first. He scanned the cafe as if looking for someone, his gaze passing right over his son. But then, something unexpected happened. As Richard approached the counter to place his order, he stumbled. He grabbed the edge of the counter to steady himself, but his face contorted in pain. Emily was standing nearby, and without a second thought, she rushed to his side. She gently helped him sit down at a table, her hands steady and sure as she guided him into the seat. Jake watched in disbelief as his father, the all-powerful billionaire, was helped by someone who had no idea who he really was. "Are you okay, sir?" Emily asked, her voice full of concern. Richard nodded, but his face remained pale. "I think I just overexerted myself today." Emily didn't hesitate. "Let me get you some water, and I'll bring you something to eat. You need to rest." Jake could hardly believe what he was seeing. This was the same man who owned half the city, the same man who could get anything he wanted with a snap of his fingers, and yet here he was vulnerable, sitting in front of a young waitress who was treating him with more care and empathy than he had received from anyone in years. Jake's mind raced as he watched Emily move about the cafe, her every action a reflection of genuine kindness. It was so different from the world his father had created. As Emily brought Richard a glass of water, Jake's curiosity got the better of him. He couldn't understand what was happening. Why was his father acting like this? Why had he never shown any sign of weakness in front of Jake before? And why was this stranger so eager to help him? Jake stood up from his table and walked over to his father's side, his heart pounding in his chest. "Dad," he said, his voice almost too quiet. Richard looked up at him, his expression hard to read. Jake hesitated before continuing, unsure of what to say. "Are you okay? You don't look so good." Richard's eyes softened for a moment. For the first time in years, Jake saw a flicker of vulnerability in his father's eyes. "I'm fine, son. Just been a long day. I'm not as young as I used to be." Jake didn't know what to make of this. His father had always been invincible in his eyes. The man who seemed to be untouchable, the one who could command rooms and build empires, now appeared fragile and human. And it was all because of this waitress, Emily. As the day went on, Jake watched in silence as Emily tended to his father. She brought him food, checked in on him regularly, and even offered to help him with anything he needed. Richard, for the first time in what seemed like forever, accepted help without argument. Jake could hardly believe what he was witnessing. It was as if his father had transformed into someone completely different, someone who was capable of being vulnerable, of accepting kindness. After a while, Richard's condition seemed to improve. His color returned, and he seemed less tense, more relaxed. He even smiled at Emily, his usual cold demeanor softened by her care. Jake, sitting across from them, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. It wasn't just that his father was allowing someone to help him. It was the way he seemed to trust Emily. It was as if the walls that had surrounded him for so long had started to crumble, and this woman, this simple waitress, was the one who had brought them down. As the afternoon turned into evening, Jake found himself lost in thought. There was so much he didn't understand. Why had his father never let his guard down like this with him? Why had he never shown Jake the same kind of care that Emily had shown him? Jake realized then that perhaps his father wasn't the man he had always believed him to be. Maybe there was more to Richard Harrington than the ruthless businessman he had grown up idolizing. But just as Jake was beginning to piece things together, Emily approached him. She stood before him with a hesitant smile, as if unsure of how to speak. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I just wanted to thank you for being so patient with your father today. He's not an easy man to care for." Jake blinked, caught off guard. "You know him?" Emily nodded. "I've seen him come in here a few times. He's a regular customer, though he doesn't usually sit down for long. But I could tell something was different today. He wasn't himself." Jake felt a strange sense of connection to this woman, someone who knew his father better than he did. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I've never seen him like that before." Emily studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Sometimes people only open up when they're vulnerable. They don't always let others see the cracks, but sometimes they need someone to help them heal. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He had always thought that vulnerability was a weakness, something to hide away. But now he was beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. As he looked at Emily, he saw something in her eyes, something that told him she knew far more than she was letting on. And in that moment, Jake realized that this encounter was no accident. There was something bigger at play here, something that would change the course of his life forever. But what? And why had Emily been the one to help his father when Jake had always been the one by his side? He had no idea. But one thing was for sure. This was only the beginning of a story that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew. And as the evening drew to a close, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The world around him was shifting, and he had no idea where it would lead. But he was about to find out. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the air. The cafe that had once felt like a quiet, mundane place had suddenly become the center of a storm. He stared across the table at his father, who had now settled into a more relaxed posture, the tension in his shoulders visibly eased by the kindness Emily had shown. Jake had never seen his father like this. In all his years of knowing Richard Harrington, the billionaire mogul, he had always been a man of control and power, unyielding, cold, and unapproachable. But today, there was a softness to him, something human, something that Jake couldn't quite grasp. Emily had left them alone for the moment, perhaps sensing that there was a conversation to be had. Richard sat back in his chair, looking out the window at the fading sunlight. For a moment, there was silence between father and son, a silence that had been rare in their relationship. It wasn't an awkward silence, though. It was the kind of quiet that came with the weight of unspoken words, the kind of quiet that allowed room for contemplation. Jake was torn. A part of him wanted to ask his father about what had just transpired, about the way he had allowed Emily to help him, the way he had shown a vulnerability he never had before. But another part of him hesitated. Was this the right moment? Had he spent too many years trying to understand his father through the lens of business and power? Or was there more to him? Something deeper that Jake had never been able to see? Jake, Richard's voice broke the silence, and Jake looked up, meeting his father's gaze. There was a depth in Richard's eyes now that Jake hadn't seen in years. "You've been quiet for a while. What's on your mind?" Jake hesitated. He wasn't sure how to ask the question that had been gnawing at him. "Dad, I don't know if I've ever really understood you. I mean, I've always admired you. But there's always been this wall between us, hasn't there?" Richard sighed, leaning forward. "Jake, I know I've been distant. I know I haven't been the father you wanted, or even the father you needed. But that's because I've been focused on one thing, building this empire. When you've spent your whole life chasing something bigger than yourself, you forget what really matters." His voice cracked slightly, a rare break in the facade of the steel-hard businessman. Jake could hardly believe his ears. His father, the man who never admitted fault, was acknowledging the rift between them. This was unprecedented. "But why now?" Jake asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Why are you showing me this side of you today? And why did you let Emily help you?" Richard leaned back again, his gaze distant, as if recalling something from long ago. "You see, Jake, when you're constantly on top, you forget what it means to need someone. You forget how to let others in. But I've been running from that for too long. I've been hiding behind this mask of invincibility, thinking that if I didn't show weakness, I wouldn't be vulnerable. But that's not living. That's existing." Jake's heart raced. His father was admitting to something he had never imagined: vulnerability. The man who had always been his hero, the man who had instilled in him the belief that strength was everything, was now speaking of fragility. Jake didn't know how to respond. He had never been prepared for this. "Emily, she reminded me of something I had forgotten," Richard continued, his voice softer now. "She showed me that sometimes it's okay to let people help. You don't always have to do it alone. For so long, I've pushed everyone away. I didn't want to be seen as weak. But it's a lonely existence, Jake. A man can have all the power in the world and still feel empty inside." Jake sat there, stunned by his father's words. There was a part of him that wanted to rush to his father's side, to tell him that it was okay, that he wasn't alone. But there was also a part of him that was angry. Angry at the years of neglect, angry at how Richard had always put business ahead of family, and angry at how he had made Jake feel small in the process. But in that moment, he realized something. His father was not just a figure of power. He was a man who had been hurt, who had been chasing something elusive without even realizing what he was missing. "You don't need to explain, Dad," Jake said, his voice quieter now, tinged with both understanding and frustration. "I get it. I do. But all those years, why did you never let me in? Why did you always keep me at arm's length?" Richard looked at Jake, his eyes full of regret. "I thought I was doing what was best for you, Jake. I thought if I built this empire, if I made sure you had everything you could ever want, that would be enough. I thought it would make you proud of me. But I was wrong. I see now that I missed the most important part. I missed being there for you, for your life, for your feelings. I missed you." The words hung in the air, heavy and thick. Jake didn't know how to respond. His mind was spinning. All these years of resentment, of bitterness, had suddenly been replaced with something unexpected: compassion. Was it too late? Was it too late for him to rebuild the relationship with his father? Or was there still hope? Just then, Emily returned to their table. She smiled softly at Richard, but when she saw the serious expressions on both father and son, she hesitated. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. Richard gave her a small, grateful smile. "Yes, Emily. Everything's fine now. Thank you for being here. Jake looked at Emily, a new sense of appreciation flooding through him. She was just a waitress, someone who had no idea who his father really was, yet she had managed to break through the walls Richard had so carefully constructed. She had shown him that there was more to life than wealth and success. And for that, Jake couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Emily," Jake said, his voice sincere. "For everything." Emily nodded, a modest smile tugging at her lips. "You're welcome. I'm just doing my job, but I'm glad I could help." As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the cafe shifted. The tension that had once hung between father and son had dissipated, replaced by something lighter, something more hopeful. Jake found himself engaging in a conversation with Richard that he had never thought possible. They talked about things that had nothing to do with business, things like Jake's childhood, Richard's own past, and the things they both wished they had done differently. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he was truly connecting with his father. And all of this had started with Emily, the unassuming waitress who had seen through the armor Richard had worn for so long. Jake realized that this was not just a turning point for his father, but for himself as well. He had spent so much of his life waiting for his father to change, waiting for him to acknowledge the emotional distance between them. But today, Jake had learned something invaluable. Change wasn't just about waiting for others to make the first move. It was about recognizing that we are all capable of change, of growth. And sometimes, the catalyst for that change comes from the most unexpected places. The following days were a blur. Jake and Richard continued to meet at the cafe, often sitting in silence, but always with the understanding that something was shifting between them. Slowly, Jake began to understand that the man who had built the Harrington empire was not just a business magnate. He was a person who had his own struggles, his own fears, his own regrets. And in that understanding, Jake found a new sense of compassion, one that allowed him to let go of the bitterness he had carried for so long. But there was still something he needed to know. He needed to understand why his father had let Emily into his life in such a personal way. He needed to know what had drawn him to her, what had made him open up when he had spent decades closing everyone out. One evening, as Jake sat across from his father at the cafe, he finally asked the question that had been lingering in the back of his mind. "Dad, why Emily? What was it about her that made you let down your guard?" Richard looked at him for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Because, son," he said quietly, "she reminded me of something I had lost, something I didn't even know I was missing until it was right in front of me. She reminded me of kindness, of real human connection. She showed me that it's okay to be vulnerable, to accept help. And that's something I had forgotten how to do." Jake nodded, understanding more than he had ever thought possible. In Emily, his father had found the one thing he had been searching for his entire life, a way back to himself, a way back to what truly mattered. And for the first time, Jake felt like he was finally seeing his father for who he really was. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling of a long-held tension. The change in Richard was subtle at first, but undeniable as time passed. He was still the same man in many ways, driven, sharp, and decisive. But there was something different about him now. His eyes had softened, and the way he looked at Jake was no longer the distant, calculating gaze of a businessman. It was something more, something deeper. It was the look of a father who had finally started to see his son for the person he truly was. For Jake, the transformation was no less profound. As he spent more time with his father, he realized that the man he had idolized for most of his life was not some infallible figure to be worshipped from a distance. Richard was human, after all, flawed, vulnerable, and capable of growth. In a way, it was both freeing and terrifying. For so long, Jake had viewed his father as an untouchable force, someone whose approval was the highest form of validation. But now, as he looked at Richard, he saw a man who had made mistakes, who had missed opportunities, and who was, for the first time, trying to make things right. It wasn't just about business anymore. It wasn't about wealth, power, or status. It was about connection, something that Jake had craved all his life but had never truly experienced with his father. The walls that had kept them apart for so long were beginning to crumble, and it felt like a new chapter was opening for both of them. One afternoon, as they sat together in the cafe, Richard turned to Jake with a more serious expression on his face. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you." Jake looked up from his coffee, sensing the weight of his father's words. "What is it, Dad?" Richard paused for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about my life lately, about all the things I've done, the choices I've made. And I've come to a realization. There's one thing I've always taken for granted, something I've never truly understood until now. And that's family." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for his father to say something like this, but now that it was happening, he wasn't sure how to react. "What do you mean?" Richard looked down at his hands, tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "I spent so many years chasing after things, money, success, power, but I never stopped to think about what it really meant to have a family, to be present, to be there for the people who matter most. I've always assumed that if I gave you everything you ever wanted, that would be enough. But it wasn't, was it?" Jake felt a lump form in his throat. For so long, he had wondered why his father hadn't been more involved in his life. He had tried to bury those feelings, to convince himself that his father's focus on his work was just part of the deal, part of the cost of being a billionaire. But deep down, Jake had always longed for more. He had wanted his father's presence, his attention, his love. And now, as Richard spoke these words, Jake realized that his father had been blind to all of this for so long. "No, Dad," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't enough. I've spent my whole life wanting you to notice me, to see me as more than just your son who would one day take over the company. But now I get it. I see you. I see the real you." Richard's eyes met his, and there was a flicker of something in them, something that Jake couldn't quite place, but it was there, undeniable. Richard was trying, really trying, to make up for the years of neglect, for the times he had put business before family. And in that moment, Jake knew that the man sitting across from him was not the same person he had resented for so long. He was a man who had learned something profound, who had been changed by his own realizations. "I've spent my whole life thinking that success was about building something bigger than myself," Richard continued. "But now I know that real success, true success, is about the relationships we build. It's about the people we love and the people who love us back. And I've failed at that. I've failed you, Jake." Jake's heart ached as he listened to his father's words. He had never expected to hear this, not in a million years. For so long, he had felt abandoned, overlooked, and resentful. But now, with every word his father spoke, the walls between them began to melt away. He could feel something shifting inside of him, something he hadn't even realized needed to change. "I'm sorry, son," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't make up for lost time, but I'm going to try. I want to be here for you now. I want to be the father you deserve." Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them back. This wasn't about crying or feeling sorry for himself. It was about something much more profound. It was about healing, about finally understanding that the relationship he had always wanted was within reach. "I've spent a lot of years waiting for you to change, Dad," Jake said, his voice steady but emotional. "And now that you have, I realize I've changed too. I've spent so long holding on to resentment that I didn't even know who I was anymore. But I'm ready. I'm ready to build something with you, Dad. I'm ready to move forward." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with significance. For the first time in Jake's life, he felt a sense of closure, something he hadn't even known he needed until now. He no longer saw his father as an obstacle to overcome, but as a man who had finally come to terms with his own shortcomings. And in that understanding, Jake found peace. Just then, Emily returned to their table, her presence a welcome interruption to the deep conversation they were having. She smiled as she set down a fresh pot of coffee, but this time there was something more to the way she looked at them, a knowing smile, as if she could sense the shift that had taken place. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her tone light and easy, though there was an underlying warmth to it. Richard smiled at her, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Yes, Emily. Everything's more than okay. You've helped me more than you know." Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward her. She had been the catalyst for this transformation. The person who had unknowingly broken through the walls Richard had spent a lifetime building. She had reminded him of something that was far more important than success, something that couldn't be bought or sold. The simple act of kindness, the human connection that had been absent for so long, was what had truly changed everything. As the conversation shifted, Jake found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He told his father about his own struggles, his own desires, and the things he had longed for but never said out loud. Richard listened intently, his expression softening as he heard Jake's words. For the first time in their relationship, there was no judgment, no walls. There was only understanding. After a while, the cafe began to empty out. The sun had set, casting a warm golden glow over the room. Richard stood up first, looking down at Jake with a sense of finality. "You know, Jake, there's a lot I can't change. But I can start with today. I can start with being here, with you. And that's what I'm going to do." Jake stood as well, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I think we've both learned a lot today." They shared a moment of silent understanding before Richard turned to Emily, who had been quietly cleaning up the nearby table. "Emily, I don't think we'll be needing anything else tonight. But I just want to say thank you. For everything." Emily nodded, a modest smile on her face. "It was my pleasure." As they left the cafe together, Jake felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. The weight that had hung over him for so long had been lifted, and he knew that moving forward, things would be different. They would never be perfect, nothing ever was. But for the first time in his life, Jake felt hopeful. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He and his father were finally starting to understand each other. And that was a beginning he could hold on to. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jake was ready to take the next step.